As woodworkers, we're more than craftsmen. We're problem solvers. We're storytellers. For challenges big or small, we dance between designs, saws, and sandpaper, shaping problems into solutions and weaving the story of it all into the wood grain. So welcome to the latest chapter in the My Grandfather's Axe series, Tiny Sloane and the Trusty Tower. My niece is extremely curious and fiercely independent. She always wants to get in on the action, often insisting on standing precariously on chairs and bar stools to do so. So to keep her safe while she tackles all the big things at home, we're making her a custom learning tower. If you're not familiar, a learning tower is meant as a safer alternative to standing on chairs for little kids. It's a fully enclosed platform designed to get them up to counter height so they can learn and engage independently alongside adults without the risk of falling off. Since I'm still new to designing my own projects, I took a lot of inspiration from learning towers I found online, but made my own modifications to account for what my sister and brother-in-law were looking for. Sloane's tower will be made from 3/4-inch pine panels and feature adjustable seat and step platforms so it can grow with her, as well as a swing arm so she can either stand fully enclosed or reposition it so she can sit down. Once the design was finalized, I decided to test out my angles and measurements by making a template of the side panel. The two sides of the tower are mirror images of each other, and I want them to be as close to identical as possible. So I figured making a template and then using a follow bit on the router to cut out the actual panels would be the best way to accomplish that. So, the template, I think we're ready to call it done. I'm really happy with how everything has gone so far, and I'm ready to do the final touches on this and then move on to the real project pieces. So let's get into it. Since I was happy with the template shape, I got it loaded up onto the 3/4-inch pine panels I'm using for the project. This is the same material that I used for the play cube build that I did for my niece earlier, which I'll link for you below, so they'll look nice and cohesive in my sister's house. If you've been following my channel for a while, you might notice I'm not using my grandpa's router for this build. Unfortunately, I've been having some issues with it where it will randomly stop in the middle of a cut and gouge out the material. I didn't want to take any risks with this build, so I got myself a new router and I'm retiring Grandpa's to the shelf as a backup. Woohoo! Yay, it worked so well! In the spirit of Akbano, or any axe hole can buy a new one, it's tough to know where to draw the line between fixing something and buying it new. I probably could have taken the old router apart and tried to monkey with it to get it working properly again, but that's pretty far out of my element, and I don't want to mess around with such a dangerous tool. So I continued on with my new router and made quick work of the two side panels. Next, I moved on to the inner handle. I cut a hole with my hole saw to start my router from and cleared out my cut. I would have liked to use my plunge base for this cut, but my follow bit is a double bearing, so I can't plunge with it. I also struggled to figure out which direction to cut from in this to avoid climb cutting, but eventually I got all of the material cleared. The two panels were pretty darn close to identical at this point, but to make them even closer, I clamped the two sides together and sanded them evenly all the way around. I could have opted for the router again here, but there really wasn't very much material to take off, so I went in with my sanders instead. With the panels complete, it was time for what quickly became the most mentally challenging part of this entire build, the dados. There's something about dados that just make me so nervous. At this point, I had already put a lot of work into the build, and the thought of taking a blade to carve out half of what I had just done just makes my heart pound. So I was triple checking all of my measurements and praying to Grandpa that it would turn out. I find using the router to cut dados just adds to my nerves. A router takes a lot of material all at once, so you can mess up your cuts pretty quickly if you're not careful. So I chose to use my circular saw on a track guide for these.
Not looking forward to this. Very nervous that I'm gonna ruin this, but here goes nothing.
And as if I wasn't already stressed enough, once I finally mustered up the courage to make this first pass, this happened.
And the battery died. Cool. Let me get a fresh one and try again.
But of course, it didn't just end there.
Why is it so difficult to make things square? You can only be sure that something is square if you have a square reference point to use to measure against. And I can't be absolutely sure that any of the edges are square.
So here I am explaining away the problem about how my cut isn't square to the top of the piece, rambling on about how difficult woodworking is, and just generally throwing a little pity party for myself. What I failed to do during this is actually double check my measurements instead of just judging my cut based on the line I had drawn. And when I did that, lo and behold, they were equal.
Oh my god. Here's the reality of woodworking and learning how to woodwork.
I'm just gonna chalk this one up to being really tired and continue on cutting these dados. In total, I had 6 dados to cut, 3 for the standing platform and 3 for the step. Because I was using my circular saw, the excess material needed to be cleared out after each dado, so I just came in with a little scraper tool to clean that up. I also came in with the router to clean up the rounded edge left on the step dados as well. Once all 6 dados were cut on the first panel, I lined it up with the second side panel and marked where they should hit so I could get them as identical as possible across the 2 platforms. This is really important because if the dados aren't equal between the 2 sides, the platform and step may not be level and it could be a safety hazard. This process took a bit of finessing, but for your sake, it was as easy as snapping my fingers. The next step was to prepare the brace pieces so I could get the 2 sides assembled together. I had the wild idea of using hidden dowel joinery for these, and I even went so far as to inset the dowels into my brace pieces and drill holes in the side panel before realizing just how difficult it was going to be to get everything lined up properly. So in the interest of both complexity and time, I opted to shave off the dowels I'd just glued in and drill some pocket holes instead. Then, once everything is together, I'll come back in and plug the holes to make it look nice and cohesive. But before I could assemble my 2 sides together, I needed to round over all of the edges and sand everything up. By this point, we had definitely hit crunch time since it was Thursday and we were hitting the road on Saturday morning to get this to my niece in time for her birthday party. So I am so glad my boyfriend Josh gave up his Thursday evening to help me sand and assemble everything well into the night. We lined up the brace pieces one by one, being sure to cover the dowel holes I had drilled earlier. At this point, I was so paranoid about making sure everything was square that we checked and checked and checked again before driving our screws. This pocket hole method worked really well, but we did run into one little issue.
Did it not grab? Is it in the hole?
No, that's in the hole probably.
Okay, so I can put a piece of wood in the hole. I have all kinds of little dowel cut-offs on the ground somewhere.
Sure. You want to glue it to glue it or just...
We'll just drop some glue in there.
Okay.
That should be fine.
You can just screw it after we drop glue in it.
Yep.
Filling some of the dowel holes just gave the screws something to bite, and luckily I had a number of perfectly sized little cutoffs laying around that I had shaved off the brace pieces earlier. At this point, everything was looking really good, and you honestly couldn't tell that there were holes hiding behind these brace pieces. But there was still a fair bit of work ahead of us, so the next day we got started on the swing arm. I got both of them cut down to size using a few awkward scraps I had from the side panels, and then added a shallow hole to one end of each of them for the connecting dowel to sit in. But before I could glue that dowel in, I needed to add holes to the other side of the swing arms as well for the heart gears to fit into. What are the heart gears, you might be wondering? Well, I'm going to pass these little connectors through the side panels and back of either swing arm to act as the gear that allows the arms to actually swing. To make them look nicer and make them easier to use, we'll embed the head of the connectors into little wooden hearts that I cut out of some scrap. I used some super glue to attach the connectors into the hearts and then glued the dowel into the swing arms, and once they were both dry, I tested the two of them together. Almost immediately, one of the hearts popped off the connector, so I knew I needed to use something stronger than super glue for this. After toying with it for a while, I remembered I had some epoxy inside that I thought would work well, so I mixed some up and encased the entire back of the heart and connector head in epoxy. This should work out well, but these are going to take 24 hours to dry, which means I have to wait and test them the day I'm delivering it. So in the meantime, I turned my attention towards the platforms and got those cut out of my remaining pine.
So, minor dilemma. When I built the seat, I was like, oh, I'll have the grain running like back to front because that'll look so nice with the rest of the grain. Forgetting that that means it's weak in the middle. So, what I should do is run the grain left to right. And that would be great, except the measurements are 1/4 inch off, so obviously that's no good. But I have this piece from when I did the cube build, which if you haven't seen, you should definitely go watch. It's another build for my niece. So I'm gonna recut the seat, but with the grain running left to right instead of front to back.
Recutting the platform solved the strength issue, but when I went to put it into the tower, I realized I had a huge flaw in my original design. Since the seat dados run all the way across the length of the side panels, there's nothing stopping the platform from sliding right out the back. So if she jumps on it or just pushes against it while climbing up, it could slide right out from under her. So I grabbed some scrap and cut little blockers to fill the back end of the seat dados on either side of the panels. Once they were dry, I cleaned them up and tried to blend them in as best I could. Of course, had I noticed this in my original design, I just wouldn't have cut the dados all the way across and it would have looked much more seamless, but this will have to do. With multiple crises averted, I went around and plugged all of the pocket holes with dowels, and then cleaned them up with my flush trim saw and some sandpaper. At this point, the epoxy hearts were pretty well dry, so I was able to do a final test of the swing arm. The gears were working well, but they weren't strong enough to hold up the bar on their own, so I inset a small dowel on either side of the tower to give the arm something to rest against and keep my niece from being able to push the arm down and potentially hurt herself. And with that small addition, the tower was complete. The only thing left to do was throw some finish on it and let her test it out for herself.
Hi, babe.
And with a problem turned to solution in the garage and all of the challenges conquered in the wood shop, now it's Sloane's turn to conquer the kitchen with her trusty tower by her side.